aspects of my research, and one of the key objectives of my talk today is to analyze the roots of Malaysia's nation-state history, as I've already mentioned. To explain how Malaya and Tanah Melayu's history was created during the colonial period. I've used the term invented during the colonial period, but you can see how it generated a lot of outrage. Okay, and my work has already generated quite a bit of both praise by Malaysian academics and also scorn by some Malaysian nationalist historians. Okay, because they say penjajah tetap penjajah. Okay, we should pay attention to that. But I think it's important to learn about colonialism because it shapes our identity, it shapes our experiences. Okay. And lastly, last part of the talk, I'll explain why colonial histories remain influential in not just Malaysia, but in former colonies as well. The closer example is Singapore. Okay, Singaporean historians are now, and this book is a good example, now challenging the nation-state history and saying we should pay more attention to our Malaysian roots as well. Okay, this serves the national narratives because the government has been consistently criticized by Singaporean historians and also members of the public that they paid too much attention to Raffles and they started Singapore history in 1819. So it's very colonial. What the Singapore government did is, all right, let's cool it down a little bit. Let's and it's good for tourism as well. Let's talk about Para Maswara and how Singapore had ancient roots before colonialism. Okay, and was part of a great empire like the Malaccan Empire as well. Sriwijaya, Majapahit, and so forth. So it serves Singapore's national interest. Okay, and if you look, yes, so explain how colonial histories remain influential in former colonies, such as Malaysia, and you can see examples of this in Australia as well, where I'm teaching. Africa, India, of course. Okay, what was India before the British came in? Many different kingdoms. Okay, what the British did, put them all together and collectively call them India. Okay, this is controversial. My Indian friends will get upset, but when I told them, then they say, "Oh yeah, it makes sense." Okay, Malaysia is the same case as well. So this is what I'll be looking at. Okay, why colonial histories remain influential in our national narratives. Right? And the reason why was because colonial histories are useful for nation building. They provide useful materials to help us write, that will be useful to help us write a nation, because we need to actually establish ancient roots. You see, the colonial historians have actually wrote a history of Malaya and linked it back to the ancient period, right? Langkah Suka and even before that. Okay? The structures are already there. You just pick and choose and adapt it into a new national narrative. Okay, and get rid of the colonial label. All right, just don't mention it. Okay, it's colonial, but don't mention it. All right? And as some historians of nation-state and nationalism have often noted, nationalism is amnesia. It's a form of amnesia. It's an act of forgetting nation-state history. You include parts of history that you want. You exclude parts of history that are not ideal, that paints the political party in a negative light. Okay. So you get one version of history that is useful to build the future nation state. Parts of my research have already been published in and resulted in 3 peer-reviewed publications. The most popular one is the one in Indonesia and the Malay world. I've already mentioned that I've published a chapter in this book on Singapore history. Okay, part of my the stuff that I'll be talking about today are also in this book as well. And this will be published in a few months' time, right? In the Journal of Current Southeast Asia. So I came up with Professor Anthony Maynor, who is a prominent scholar on Malaysian history in this work, and he's pretty much in my supervisory panel as well. And his approach had a huge impact on the way I look at history. Okay, and all of this is based on my PhD thesis. Okay, I've expanded it. All of it is, yeah, so this is linked to the results of my PhD thesis. And my presentation here today is pretty much reflects my current project because I'm thinking of turning what I'm talking about here today into a book. Okay, so I'm currently just still searching for a publisher. Okay, a publisher that is ideally not too expensive, so all of you can read it. So an academic publisher, but is still accessible. Okay. And I don't have time to talk about the sources that I've used. This can be very boring. But just to summarize, I've used both colonial archival sources, of course colonial histories as well, and also Malay sources too. The hikayats, I make good use of the Malay hikayats as a way of understanding how British colonial historians use Malay histories to write a history of Malaya. How they selectively use parts of this Malay history to write a history on the region. Because if you read, for those of you, how many of you have read the hikayats? None of you are. It's very. You understand that the Malay hikayats are very well suited to write a history of Indonesia. All right, because Malaysia is only a small portion, okay, of the Malay hikayats. But British colonial historians, they ignore the useless part, the Indonesian part. Back then it was the Dutch East Indies, and just focus on Malaya and the Malaccan Sultanate. Okay, so that's how the colonial historians make good use of Malay sources to write history of Malaya. So the focus would be on the British colonial state itself. Okay, parts of the colonial sources that were friendly to Thailand, they also ignore. All right, because if you read the Malay hikayats, the Malay sultans had a very close relationship with Thailand. They say then there was one part where in the hikayat Baru Mahawangsa where the king died, and the bendahara he could have taken over as the next sultan, but he didn't want, because doing so is derhaka, traitorous. So what he did was he asked the king of Siam to nominate a Malay king. So this is in the hikayat Baru Mahawangsa, but there is colonial historians do not want to mention that. Why? Any ideas? Colonial historians, when they wrote histories, it was of Malaya, it was the early 20th century. They did not want to mention that. Right? They used the hikayat Baru Mahawangsa, but that was not mentioned in their histories at all. Why? Any guesses? Okay. Who were the British fighting for control with when you're talking about the Malay Peninsula? Siam, exactly. So Thailand, Siam at the time, the King of Siam had good political, was also claiming, had political claims over Malaya. So if British colonial historians emphasize that close connection to Siam, this would give political legitimacy to an endorsement to Siam. All right. And I don't think our national history also pays attention to our close with the political relationship with Siam. So that is conveniently ignored as well. But it is there in the Hikayat Baru Mahawangsa. And the Hikayat Baru Mahawangsa even suggested that the king of Siam and Perak had very good relationship. They see each other often. They call each other brothers and sisters. And the king of Perak, the Sultan of Perak, would go to Thailand, and the Thai king would be so pleased to see him. Okay, so it shows very close historical connection and also historical roots between the Malay Peninsula and our good neighbor Thailand. Okay, that is quite often underappreciated, but it's there in the hikayats. Okay, I find the Oxford history of historical writing quite useful in my research as well, because it's a history of how nation-state histories are created, and I look at it within the context of how other countries do it as well. Okay, how Japan write their nation-state history, how China write its nation-state history is very interesting, because the idea of China, a lot of it only really took shape, the idea of modern China, in the 19th and 20th century. Okay, so this is something that not many people are And how many of you know this person? Wong-Colonial. He is arguably the best scholar that Malaysia had ever created. Okay? Wong-Colonial, very important because he talks about the nation state a lot. For those of you how many of you have read his biographies? Home is not here. I encourage you to read it because he talks about his contradictions of being a Chinese, and also a Malaysian. What is a Malaysian? Okay, when Malaysia was was formed in when Malaya was formed in 1957, right? Yeah, 1957. Okay, malu if I didn't get it right. There was kind of a question of, what is a Malaysian? What is a Malaysian? So his works on nation building and nation state is crucial to my works as well because he talks about it within the Malaysian context by using his own personal experience on nation building. There are many different versions of what a Malaysian is. There's the Malay, Malaya version, and then there's the multicultural version. Okay, the Malayan version. We are all Malayans. Okay, so he talks about that as well. So he's a very good source. And Arvin Omar looks at the idea of Bangsa Melayu as well. A very good book. I encourage you to read it as well. Arvin Omar is, I think he's a politician. I'm not sure whether he's still in politics, no longer. Yeah, so he's a very good book. And of course, Tong Chai Bin Charcoal's book on Siam Map looks at how Siam adopted European approaches in writing their history. Okay, how they adopted European approaches to create a new Thai nation. Okay, and they did it. They had to adopt European approaches of looking at borders for their own personal survivals because Europeans were starting to lay claim to territories in Southeast Asia. And the Thai king was like, if I don't adopt these Western methods of looking at maps and history, my kingdom will be in danger. Okay. So it's a good way of looking at the history of cross-cultural encounters and looking at the impact of Western colonialism in shaping how we look at the world. Because Thai map before the 19th century was very different, very difficult to read. This is a good example of one of the modern Thai maps where they employed European surveyors to draw a modern map of Thailand. Okay, a lot of this was also happening during the colonial period in Malaya as well. Because as I told my students in international relations, Southeast Asian monarchs, they don't have the same Westphalian understanding that your sovereignty is tied to the land. Okay, and your power is based on how large your empire is, how much territory you control. To the Malay sultans, territory is useless if there's no one in it. Alright, it's about how many subjects you have. Okay, how useful is territory when you don't have subjects in it? So that's the reason why some of these European sultans, right? When European officials were looking to these lands, they're happy to give some islands, because they say this land is not very useful for me because not many people in there. Okay, so because there's facts because their understanding of territory doesn't have the same concept as Europeans. Okay. So I better keep going to avoid just to make sure that I don't go over time. All right, sorry I got a bit too excited. My works and my students quite often complain that sometimes I go off tangent. Some like it, some don't like it. Okay, especially the very studious one. Tell me what's in the exam now. There's always, regardless of whether you're in Malaysia, Singapore, or in Australia, there's always going to be the kiasu ones. Alright, so this is the outline of my talk. So I'll start by looking at the definitions of the Malay Peninsula before the 20th century, both European definitions and also Malay definitions in the Hikayat. I'll look at the Malay Hikayats and say this is how the Malay Peninsula was taught by local Malay sources. Okay. I also next I'll be looking at how Britain expanded into the Malay Peninsula and how as they expanded into the Malay Peninsula, how they started to geopolitically construct parts of the Malay Peninsula that came under their colonial control and label it Malaya. Okay? So Malaya was pretty much all of the British territories in the Malay Peninsula, they came under British control, and they label it British as well, British, okay, to make it, to emphasize that. I'll also look at, they did not only construct Malaya, they also change the definition of Tanah Melayu as well. Okay, you can understand how my works are creating controversy amongst some nationalists, historians in Malaysia as well. But my findings are based on historical evidence, okay, and not on speculation or sentiment. I'll also look at next, after looking at how Britain expanded extension back to the geopolitical construction of Malaya and Tanah Melayu. I will look at how British historians contributed to the Malacca and Malay Kerajaan-centric construction of Malaysia's and Malaysia's history as well. Because if you look at our national history, it's very Kerajaan-centric. Okay, Malaysian history is shaped by the actions of the sultans, Kerajaan. So it's very Sultan-centric. Okay, and the British colonial historians endorse that. They endorse that. Okay, one of the reasons why is because they have good. It's part of their political array. That's part of their political strategy of expanding colonial control in the Malay Peninsula. You do it through the agency of the local rulers, the sultans. Okay, so it is in their interest to make sure that the sultan remains in power, and the histories also help promote that as well. Right? The history actually legitimizes the rule of the sultans, who sometimes had poor claims to their thrones as well. Okay, they overthrew more rightful heir and so forth. Okay, I won't go too much into that. So I look at how historians during the colonial period contributed to the Malacca and Malay Kerajaan-centric construction of Malaya's history. Next, I'll look at the legacies of colonialism in Malaysia's national narrative, which you see everywhere. All right, even in this museum as well. Right? It's there. Lastly, I look at how Malaysia's history can be interpreted differently, away from the Malay and Kerajaan-centric mold of, away from the Malacca-centric and Sultan-centric framework of history. Okay. So let's look at the definitions of the Malay Peninsula before the 20th century. If you look at, this is a map that I use all the time when I teach about empires. Okay, you look at map of Southeast Asia today, you can see that the borders of these countries are drawn according to colonial interests. Right? Are drawn according to the legacies of empires. Philippines are all the territories in Southeast Asia that came under Spanish control. Malaysia, all the territories that came under British rule. Indonesia, all the territories that came under Dutch rule. Okay, and you can see aspects of this in mainland Southeast Asia as well. Okay, Laos, Vietnam, and even Thailand has not escaped this as well, because if it wasn't for colonialism, the Thai border may have extended further into the Malay Peninsula as well. And the Japanese gave it was Kedah or Perak back to the Japanese during the Second World War. Okay, so you can see that how colonialism even affected Thailand as well. Even though Thailand today claim that we weren't affected, we're free from colonialism, but colonialism did impact its borders as well. Right, and even the names of these countries had colonial roots as well. Okay, Philippines. Where did Philippines get its name from? King Philip of Spain, right? It was a Western term, but you can see the powerful impact of colonialism in shaping local identities. This is a good example of the indigenization of Western knowledge, colonial knowledge, to the extent that everyone will proudly call themselves Filipinos today. It's become part of their identities. Okay. Indonesia was also wasn't a local term as well. Okay, it was created. How many of you have read the Journal of the Indian Archipelago and Eastern Asia? Right? It was the predecessor of James Russ, right? Journal of Malaysian branch of Royal Asiatic Society. The founder of the Journal of the Indian Archipelago and Eastern Asia, James Richardson Logan, was the one who created the term Indonesia. Okay, so Indonesia was also created by the West as well, but it became adopted and localized, and now many people, millions of Indonesians proudly call themselves Indonesia. It's even a name that they would die for as well. Okay, and surprise, surprise, Malaysia had Western roots as well. The name it was adopted by Tunku Abdul Rahman to indicate the broader merger of Peninsular Malaysia with Borneo states as well. Okay, and I'll show you historical evidence so that you can see later on by looking at the maps. Before colonialism, many of these countries like Philippines, Malaysia, and of course Indonesia as well were many kingdoms. Okay, many kingdoms and were sites of many empires as well that appeared and vanished over time. I've read a very good work. It's a local Malaysian university journal. It's a Malay work. And she noted, she's a Malay scholar in publishing this journal, she noted that even towns in Malaysia now, like Klang and Kemaman, were once kingdoms, you know. Yeah, I had no idea. Okay, so it showed that even in Malaysia as well, there were many different kingdoms that existed and vanished over time. Some would have been lost to history. Okay, unfortunately. Okay. Oh, I'm going backwards. Now wait. Okay, so let's do a map reading exercise. If you look, this was 17th century. I don't think it was a Dutch map. I'm not 100% sure, but I need to check and confirm. But regardless, this is a European map. Okay, 17th century map. Look at the whole of the Malay Peninsula is called the Malacca. Okay, no clear boundaries whatsoever. Just label Malacca. This one is an 1862 English map. And you can see that the whole of the Malay Peninsula was gradually called Malay Peninsula. Okay, no clear boundaries, of course, like Perak, Pahang, Terengganu, Kelantan, but no clear boundaries. Those boundaries were drawn by European surveyors when they expanded into the region. And there's a historical account in which European asked one of the sultans, "Hey, where's the boundary of your kingdom?" Huh? The sultan just draws sketches on the rivers. And that's it. As I said earlier on, it's not about the size of your territory, it's who are my subjects? You live in this river and you live in that river. That's more important. Okay? So that's why the boundaries were very vague. Okay? And the only places that have boundaries are the Strait settlements, parts that came under British colonial rule. Malacca, Penang, and Singapore. Okay? This map here, look at what the Malay Peninsula was called. Generally called Malays. So this is another 19th century map, 1866. Okay? Just called Malays, and that's pretty much it. I've looked at I can't show you all the maps that I've looked at, but Malaya was also used in some of these maps, but they were used to define the entire Malay Peninsula up to the Kra Isthmus in modern-day Thailand. Okay, so it's used interchangeably to refer to the whole of the Malay Peninsula when Malaya was used. Malaya was also used broadly to refer to the Malays as well. Okay, in the 6th, 17th century by European powers, not just the English, but the Spaniards and other European powers. Malaya, sometimes they call them Malays Malaya instead. Okay. I've come across maps that refer to the entire Indian archipelago, the entire Indian archipelago, Malaya. Okay, so this was how Malaya was used in European sources.
Sorry,
Yep.
you mentioned Indian archipelago, not
Yep.
Malay archipelago.
Malay archipelago and Indian archipelago are both the same things. You can easily get confused when you look at 18th century writings because they use both terms. Indian archipelago and Malay archipelago, both terms are the same. They're used interchangeably. So thank you for pointing that out.
Is it because there were a lot of Indians here?
No, because European colonial sources used to call the whole of Southeast Asia as India. Yeah, so that's how. When you talk about British India, right? The brand, I went to British India yesterday and looked at it. Wow, so expensive, huh? British India was used to refer to India as we know today, but also the East Indies as well. Okay, so that's why when you look at 18th century writings on Malay Peninsula, you see a lot of references to British India. I'm going to India. Okay, by going to India, you can also mean that you're going to Malaya. No? So this was quite often used by colonial officers when they say that they are going to be posted to Malaya. They say I'm going to India as a general term. So India also refers to parts of the British Empire in Southeast Asia as well.
When you use that term East India Company, is that also the same thing?
Yes,
East India Company.
Yeah, so that's the origins of the term India and how it was used back then. Okay, so very good questioning there because we're all interested about historical roots. Right? That's the purpose of studying history. Right? Know your roots because past shapes the present. Yes.
How about Borneo and beneath it says
Kalimantan.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Pulau P means could be Pulau
yeah,
Kalimantan. So they actually, you can say this provides hints that the locals would have referred to Kalimantan as Pulau Kalimantan as well. Yeah, I'm not I don't have background knowledge on this, but this is possible. Okay, by looking at the maps, because sometimes European charters they ask the locals, hey, what do you call this place? Some say that, some would say that we call this land this. Sumatra was called Pulau Percha. Pulau Percha. Yeah, Percha. At least in the 19th, 20th century, sandstone. Pulau Percha.
What does that mean?
I have no idea. Pulau Percha. Pulau Percha. Yeah. You see this in Malay writings in the 20th century. They refer to Sumatra as Pulau Percha. Yeah, up to 1940s. They call it Pulau Percha. So you look at the newspapers, you mentioned Pulau Percha, right? Is Sumatra. Yeah. So you can see how definitions and names they do change. Okay. You see, some of them we don't know anymore because no longer used. Okay. So this is a fun thing when you look at maps. So you used to call this place this. Yeah. So I encourage you to look at the map itself because a lot of them are digitized. Okay. A lot of them are digitized, and you can just download this and. Lucky best, you can print them in high definition, print it out, go to the print shop, print it out very cheap, and get it framed. Then this is what I did. This is what I did for this map. When I was a research fellow in Singapore, I got access to the National Library of Singapore digital collections. So I use it to print this high definition map, A1 size, get it properly framed, and wow, so beautiful. 1836 map. Okay, you can see it's a very beautiful map. But I made an accidental discovery in this map, I will look at it further, and guess what I discovered? This is a zoom in. Malaysia, 1836 map. Where is Malaysia? The entirety of archipelago Southeast Asia, or at least the Malay archipelago is called Malaysia. So if you want to see what Malaysia was in the 19th century, that referred to Indonesia, present-day Indonesia, Philippines, and Borneo Peninsula, Malaysia. And that Tengku Abdul Rahman, he was aware of this term, and he started to use this term.
That's interesting.
To indicate the broader merger of Malaysia with Borneo and Singapore. This, of course, pissed Suharto off a lot. And he actually, he saw that as a colonial plot.
yeah.
Suharto had some historical grounds to see Malaysia as a colonial plot because of like how our boundaries were drawn by colonialism. But you can say the same thing about Indonesia also. Like you inherited the boundaries of the Dutch, but you also put another colonial plot, right? What are you talking about? Okay. So yeah, so there you go. You know, this was how Malaysia was used in the 19th century. It was used to refer generally to archipelago Southeast Asia. Okay. This is another map here. 1860 map. My memory is quite bad. 1860 map, and of course, as usual, the Malay Peninsula are labeled as being under British rule. All right, red, clear boundaries. Most of the states in the Malay Peninsula are called independent Malay states. 1860, according to the Europeans, independent Malay states. Where is how about Kedah, Terengganu, Kelantan? Where is Kedah, Terengganu, and Kelantan? Where are they? In Siam. The British were not joking around, no, because they need to know where the boundaries are. You can't simply cut down here because or you can't simply interfere in here because this is under Siamese. If it's not completely under Siamese rule, they were Siamese vassals. Okay, Siamese king will be like hands off. Okay, these are my subjects. Right, these are my kings. Okay, my under kings. Right. So in your social media posts that you see on Malaysian history, sometimes there's a lot of denial about Kedah and Perak's historical links to Siam, but it contradicts historical evidence. Okay? Always go to the historical evidence. When you see claims about Malaysian history, right, by some kampung people, always ask, where's your evidence? Where are your roots? Okay, the evidence is there, and it's quite often they are easily accessible. Okay? Right. How about Malay references to the Malay Peninsula? Well, in the Sejarah Melayu, this is how the Sejarah Melayu call the Malay Peninsula. They call it negeri-negeri di bawah angin, lands beneath the wind. Okay, lands beneath the wind. I don't know what it actually means, lands beneath the wind, but that's what they call it. It's like quite nice, lands beneath the wind. Negeri-negeri di atas angin, correct. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, I did too much teaching with this, so I need to get back to research. Ujung tanah. I tried to translate it. It's quite awkward. Lands, end of the land, lands, ends. Yeah, end of the land, ujung tanah, which makes sense. The peninsula is at the end, right, of the continent. The bigger version, ujung tanah besar. Okay, great end of the land, something like that. Surprise, surprise. Sejarah Melayu, no mention of tanah Melayu.
Yeah.
Okay, no mention of tanah Melayu. Hikayat Hang Tuah, the version that I've read is the Romanized version of the Dewan Bahasa Pustaka Romanized version. It was, I think, a 19th century copy. I'm interested in looking at the Jawi earlier copies of Hikayat Hang Tuah to see whether tanah Melayu was also mentioned. But it did mention tanah Melayu, but it was very vague. It was referred to in a more geographical sense, and it could indicate anywhere with a Malay settlement, tanah Melayu. It could also indicate Sumatra also. Right? That could be called tanah Melayu. Also, and I'll show you historical evidence later of how tanah Melayu was used by the Malays to refer to other parts of Southeast Asia, especially Sumatra, that had Malay settlements. Okay. Tufat al-Nafis. Oh, I love Tufat al-Nafis. It's the best, this, other than Hikayat Mahawangsa, it's one of the most interesting works of Malay literature to read. I find that Sejarah Melayu quite difficult to read because confusing. Okay, the narratives are not tidy. Right, it's all over the place. Okay, the chronological writing or history that we come across follows the European tradition. Right? Dates, chronology, and so forth. This is the training that we get as professional historians. We look at the roots of modern historical writings. Okay. Tufat al-Nafis, they refer the Malay Peninsula as sebelah Melayu. Okay, the Malay side. They call the Malays ungrateful in Tufan al-Hafiz, was written by the Bugis. They say we help the Malays win the wars, and look at what I did, they try to kick us out. How ungrateful. Yeah, how ungrateful, how treacherous. Okay, we help the Sultan of Johor, came strong, and now look at what you did to me, you try to kick us out. Our sejarah narrative, look at them as conquerors, the Bugis as conquerors, but it's important to look at it from their lands also. Okay, from both lands. Hujung Tanah again, lands and negeri di bawah angin, yes, Tufan al-Hafiz also says that. And again, very big, Tanah Melayu is very big, anywhere with a Malay settlement. Okay, it can be used to refer to like Riau as well. Okay. Hittite Mahahangsa, quite similar, but no reference to Tanah Melayu. Okay. So now I look at British expansion and the beginning of the historical creation of Malaya. British expansion and the beginnings of the historical construction of Malaya as a political entity. Most historical research have pointed out that it was Frederick Welt who first came up in the 19th century. He was the High Commissioner or Governor of the Straits Settlements. He was the first one who came up with the concept British Malaya in the 19th century in a correspondence. Okay, but it was this person here, Frank Hinton, according to Henry Barlow's biography, I think Henry Barlow's biography, some of you may know him. He was considered very handsome back in those days. So this is pretty much the epitome of Victorian Edwardian handsomeness. And he was hot because he was considered as an imperial hero as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So Swain Sitohang was the first person to write a history of British Malaya. That was the first history ever written on British Malaya. So what is British Malaya? So his British Malaya is the whole of the Malay Peninsula, including Siam as well. All right, up to Songkhla. Okay, Patani definitely included. That reflects his imperial ambition to expand British control up to Songkhla in Thailand, the whole of the Malay Peninsula. So his book British Malaya reflects a British colonial ambition, at least his colonial ambition. Okay. So you can say that if that succeeded, Malaysia could have been much bigger. Okay? So that's pretty much his construct of British Malaya in his history. R.J. Wilkinson, he very well respected scholar on the Malays, even today as well. A lot of Malay scholars, they couldn't find fault in his works. That's pretty much how good it is. Okay, they personally told me myself, my Malay scholars, that actually R.J. Wilkinson works, right? A lot of Malay nationalist scholars, when they start reading it, they yell Malay because they say actually his books are pretty good. Because you never read, So he wrote the history of the Peninsula Malays, still widely cited today in works on Malaysia and Malay history. But he's so his work is on the history of the Malays in British Malaya. Okay, but the boundaries of his British Malaya was quite limited. It's only parts of Malaya that came under British control in 1909. So his history does not include the unfederated, what will be known later as the unfederated Malay states, Kelantan, Terengganu, and also Kedah. Okay, so his history, because 1909, these states have not come under British colonial rule as well. So the scope of his history of the Peninsula Malays was quite limited. But nonetheless, it was still significant because he's talking about the Malays in British Malaya. So he's shifting the focus of Malay cultural history into the British portions of Malaya. All right, and this effects turns the Malay Peninsula as the center of Malay civilization and culture. Okay, he did mention Indonesia, but out of convenience. Kayla, you need to talk about origins like it came from Indonesia, but only out of necessity. Okay, Alan Mills also published a book on British Malaya, 1824 to 1867, but his British Malaya, he only focuses on the Strait settlements. Why? Because 1824 to 1867, that was what essentially British Malaya was, only Strait settlements. Okay? They only expanded, the British Empire only expanded from the Strait settlements into mainland Malay Peninsula after the Treaty of Angkor in 1874. Okay? And as they expanded, they started calling parts of the Malay Peninsula that came under the territorial control British Malaya. Okay, to emphasize that distinction. And I visited the Pahang Museum in Pekan lately. It's a very good museum.
Yeah.
They hired the right sort of people because it was definitely very Kerajaan biased, Sultan Pahang biased, but they did a good job. Yeah, they did a good job, so they hired the right people like that and said, you can actually write, I can see what you're trying to do, but it's done properly. Okay, so they hired real professionals to do that. And his portrait was in that museum. And this was pretty much how he is remembered today as a prominent Malay scholar who contributed a lot to scholarship on the Malays. But he's controversial because due to his colonial background.
Is he a German?
Winstead is Swedish.
Swedish.
Yes, Swedish.
But he's
his family
British.
settled down in Britain. Yeah, so that's why he got his. That's why his Winstead name. That's where his surname is from. Because his mom his dad was from Sweden, right? Naturalized British. Okay, because they settled down in Oxford, and he was brought up as British, even though he still remembers his Swedish roots. He can speak many different languages. Okay, so that's one of the advantages that he had. He understands Dutch, so this gives him a significant advantage when studying the Malay Peninsula because he can look at Portuguese sources, he can look at Dutch sources, and his mastery of Malay is superb as well. Alright? So superb that if you read, I came across a Utusan Melayu article, and in that Utusan Melayu article, Dewan Bahasa Pustaka was using his Malay dictionary to try to standardize the Malay language. That was his mastery of the Malay language. Okay, don't play. You people quite often say Masalay like Bodo and that, don't understand history. He is still controlling our national narrative. He also had an influence on our Malay language. Right? In 19th century, 20th century, early 20th century, if you look at the colonial census, most of the Malay population was in Kelantan and Terengganu. The question is, why didn't we adopt the Kelantan and Terengganu Malay dialect as our national language? Okay, you can blame him. Because he placed a lot of emphasis on the Malacca Sultanate, Malacca Johor Sultanate, and therefore the narrative is the Malay language follows the structure of the Malay spoken in Malacca, Johor, and Riau. So that's the history of our national language. That told in 3 minutes. Yeah, and the reason why the British were more interested in Malacca and Johor was because Kedah and Terengganu, they were long under Chinese influence, so they had no interest. In the context of post-colonial Malaysia, PASMA, right? Who was controlling post-colonial Malaysia? UMNO, right? So they had no much political interest to emphasize Terengganu and Kelantan as the center of Malay history and culture. And many Malay historians actually quite noted that Kelantan and Terengganu are underappreciated historically, and they have very good grounds in that. Okay. What about other states? There were other Malay states as well, yes, but Perak, Selangor, 20th century, how was the Malay population? Majority of the population in Perak were Chinese, in the 20th century. Selangor also. Yeah, Pahang was also becoming affected already. Okay, if you look at the colonial census, you'll be shocked. Okay, it's up to date. That's the reason why when Singapore wanted to merge with Malaysia, UMNO leaders weren't too enthusiastic because they knew very well that this would unsettle the ethnic balance in Malaya. Okay, it was only with the merger with Sabah and Sarawak that those fears will come down a little bit because the Bumiputras, the ethnic communities from Sabah Sarawak, so this will water down the ethnic demographic imbalances instead. Sorry. So Sir Richard Olaf Winstead, the roots of our Malaysian history, he pioneered our national history actually, because he was the first historian to write about the history of Malaya and Tanah Melayu that reflects Malaysia's post-colonial state narrative. The structure of the way our history is structured is the same way as how he structured Malaya's and Tanah Melayu's history. He was a scholar. Winstead was a scholar and administrator that served in Malaya until 1935. His first posting was in Perak. I think it was 1902. The next slide will show, will have a summary of his background. He had about 30 over years in Malaya. Okay, a very long time. That's why his Malay is very good. Because quite often he complained in his biography, they chuck him in all these blue places, and the only people he can speak to were Malays. Okay, so he earned Malays in that way, and he loved eating durian as well. Okay, the reason why he loved eating durian was because there was one time that he was very hungry in these ulu places in Perak, and he saw durians in the corner. So he was so hungry, he ate, and after that he loved durian. He hated durian at first, but after that he loved durian. And the funny thing is, many years later, after he retired from Malaya, the Sultan of Johor's family visited him in England, in London. Okay, and they managed to bring durian. So in the newspaper, in the British newspaper, it said the Sultana and family visited Winstead in his house, and they opened a durian. In London, how did you manage to bring the durian in London? Yeah. So his durian obsession with him all the way to even in years after his retirement. Okay, he had a very close relation with the Sultans and also the Malays as well, including Tunku Abdul Rahman. I'll show you later. Okay, pictures of him and Tunku Abdul Rahman. This exposes the complexity of colonialism that a lot of unknown leaders had, including Tunku Abdul Rahman, had very close working relationship with the British colonial administration, and of course this won't be mentioned in the national narratives. Okay, right, and Winstead's example reflects those close relationships. His history was significant because unlike Frank Swettenham and Wilkinson and his predecessors, his history actually captures the present-day boundaries of Peninsular Malaysia. Okay, his history includes the history of all the states as well. Right, so that's why his history is significant. And what distinguishes his history from Swettenham's historians such as Swettenham was that he wrote the history of Malaya using a modern scientific approach of evidence-based history. How many of you have read Swettenham's British Malaya? Sometimes ridiculous, right? Yeah, it's like, where's your evidence? It's more as a professional historian, not sensationalist, historical writing. Yeah, exactly, storyteller. So it's pretty much simply his views on Malaya and its history. Okay, Winstead is different. His history are mostly based on this is what colonial sources say, and he quotes them. This is what the Malays hikayats say, and he makes extensive use of the Malay hikayats. Okay, so he knows what he's doing, and his histories provided the historical foundation for Malaysia's nation-state history. So if you have a chance, and if you can get a copy of Swettenham's Winstead's 1935 book on Malaya, just read it. You'll be amazed that this looks like our national history. Very similar. If you remove his name and the date of the publication, you think that it's a recent work on Malaysian history. Yeah, I'm telling you that I was shocked when I read his work. Actually, I was sejarah kebangsaan, and sure enough, he was the one who pioneered this structure, okay, which was adapted during the post-colonial period. And he remains the historian who single-handedly wrote the most history on Malaysia even up to now. Okay, our state history, sejarah like Johor and that. He was the one who wrote like the first modern history of Johor. Perak, he also wrote it. Selangor, not so good but he wrote Negeri Sembilan. He also wrote it. A lot of state histories he wrote. The only one that he didn't touch was Kelantan, Terengganu, and Pahang. Pahang he didn't touch. Perlis, I won't say much. Perlis was it's a good example of Siamese state imperialism, because it was a state that was created by Siam after they invaded Kedah. Alright, after that they created a buffer state called Perlis and installed a sultan. Yeah, so that's pretty much the history of the origins of Perlis as a state. Alright, otherwise Perlis would have been part of the Sultanate of Kedah. They invaded Kedah in the early 19th century. It was a very bloody invasion. Okay, just to punish Perak for not supporting it in Siam in its war against Burma. And the Kedah Sultan was like this. Burma was now asking me to support him in his war against Siam. Siam also asking me to support the war against Burma. Who do I side? I side the winning side. I think Burma's winning. Unfortunately, Burma was losing, and Siam was like, after they win, why you support Burma? And then they actually punish. And that was when Kedah tried to ask, for help from the East India Company. Say, look, we lease you like the land, come and help us. Unfortunately, the British East India Company weren't interested in giving the war. Okay, so that's pretty much a short history of. And from that invasion, that's when Siam created Perlis as a buffer state. Okay, that's the history of Perlis. And this is pretty much a brief summary of his background. He was born in Oxford in 1878, Swedish ancestry. Okay, his first post was as a district officer in Perak. He later became the Director of Education, Assistant Director of Education in Malaya, and later on he was elevated to Director of Education in Malaya. So he determined the curriculum of the Malay schools and other schools in Malaya. Okay, that was one of his roles. He retired from the Malayan Civil Service in 1925, right after serving as the General Advisor of Johor from 1931 to 1935. That was the highest post he held. Okay, Sultan Ibrahim loved him a lot apparently, and in his correspondence with SOAS, I read his letters. He said, "Hey, please don't tell the Sultan of Johor that I'm actually leaving Johor. Right? He won't let me go. Yeah, he won't let me go because so the Sultan of Johor just felt that he was kind of indispensable, in running his state." So he spent about altogether, and he became reader of Malay in SOAS. Okay? He spent about 32 years in Malaya, and he died on the 2nd of June 1966. That's my birthday. I was born 2nd of June 1986. Okay? So very close coincidence.
What does reader of Malay mean?
It was an old title,
Specialist.
today it's like Professor of Malay Studies, but it's a British thing. We call it reader. Some of you may understand it a lot better than me. It's the equivalent of Professor of Malay languages in today's context. Okay, so that was what reader of Malay is. And that's a picture of him and his wife somewhere in Malaya, and it was provided by his niece. Actually, I managed to correspond with his niece. He provided me with all of these pictures of his niece. And that was the map of British Malaya when Winstead was writing his history. Okay, and you can see how it reflects the present boundaries of Peninsular Malaysia today. Okay. And whenever there is a dispute between countries today, right, they'll go back to the colonial maps to make territorial claims. Malaysia has done that when they're fighting for, when they were contesting territory with Thailand. With Singapore also, both Singapore and Malaysia will look at the colonial records when they're actually trying to contest the lighthouse, the Jakarta. Okay, so it's irony, isn't it? Like there's a lot of saying, I reject colonial sources, but when you need it, you go back to the colonial sources. Like, yeah, colonial sources say this, isn't it? So a lot of hypocrisy, like that. So I come across a lot of this like in historiography. So this is pretty much the boundary of British Malaya when Winstead was writing his history. So then you can see why his histories capture pretty much the present day like boundaries of Peninsula Malaysia. He wrote the history of all of the states, okay, in his histories. And this is the first English book that is published on Malayan history. Okay? 1923 book. And that's the fallout map. This is my copy of this book, and that's the fallout map. I managed to get it from a second-hand shop. And this book was significant. You can see that Winstead's attempt in geopolitically changing the definition of Malaya. In the introduction of his book, Winstead said, I understand that the term Malaya can be very broad. It was used to refer to the entire present-day Indian archipelago Southeast Asia. It was used to refer to the whole of the Malay Peninsula, but by Malaya, I want you to think about British Malaya now. Right? This is what I mean when I talk about Malaya in my book. And you read that very clear. Malaya is the straight settlements and the federated tourist states. This is how I want you to think about Malaya. So you can see the intentional narrowing down of the term Malaya and centering it on parts of the British, parts of the Malay Peninsula that came under British colonial control. So this is an act of turning a colonial state in the Malay Peninsula into a country, and we gave it a Malay identity as well. Okay, so we turn like the colonial state in Malaya into a Malay state by writing the history. Okay, so history writing is important because it determines and shapes the identity of a particular nation. Okay, it gives it a legitimacy, it gives it an identity. Okay. And Winstead was also responsible for the construction of the term Tanah Melayu as well. Okay, the Malay word, very nationalistic word that is used to refer to peninsula like Malaysia today. So, and he the first history that Winstead wrote on Malaya was not in the English language. It was in fact written in Malay. Kitab Tawarikh Melayu. Okay, and it was used as a textbook in Malay schools in Malaya. A history textbook, and it was written by Winstead. Okay, Kitab Tawarikh Melayu. So it was the first, in context of Malaysia, it was the first history of Tanah Melayu that was written using a modern historical approach. Because it's different from the Hikayats, right? The Hikayats, it doesn't have a clear chronology in that, and it's not the history of the state, it's the history of the Sultan. Okay? And as I say, it was used as a textbook in Malay schools in Malaya. And when Winstead wrote the history of Kitab Tawarikh Melayu, he pretends to be a Malay person. Okay, he said that the Malays used to have these practices in Hinduism and Buddhism, which is sangat berdosa, very sinful in the eyes of Islam. Instead of that, all right, and he did that so that the Malays, when they read it, they seem as if another Malay person is speaking as one of them. So he tries to identify as Malay in this work. And Tanah Melayu was presented as if it was a political entity. So previously I've noted how Tanah Melayu, when it was referenced, it was a vague term that could also imply or refer to Sumatra and generally as a geographical term to refer to the Malay Peninsula. It was a very vague term. And Winstead transformed the concept of Tanah Melayu and presented it in his history as if it was a political entity. And he equated the boundaries of Tanah Melayu to British Malaya. Okay, so Tanah Melayu was very broad. He narrowed it down to just like the British colonial state. This is Tanah Melayu now. Okay, and of course he excluded Siam, right, from his Then he presented like Tanah Melayu as if it was the homeland of Malay. So you can look at this work by Winstead, Kitab Tanah Melayu, as the first national history of Tanah Melayu itself. Okay, and the scope of Tanah Melayu, from prehistory, the orang asli, the arrival first arrivals of Malay settlers, to the present, when Tanah Melayu fell under British control. So that was the scope of his history. That's very broad. It's important because it gave Tanah Melayu, okay, British Malaya, ancient roots, ancient foundation, which is vital if you want to write a national history. Right? You need to show that you have ancient roots, okay, that your country comes from somewhere, right, and a long historical existence. Okay. And he placed the Malacca Sultanate as the heart of Malay civilization in Tanah Melayu. And by doing so, he encouraged Malays from across Tanah Melayu, from all the different states, Johor, Pahang, all right, Selangor. Some of the Malays even came from Java. Their parents came from Java into the Malay Peninsula to identify with the Malaccan Sultanate. Okay, this is a bit unnatural, right? Why would you, a loyal subject of the Sultan of Johor, suddenly identify with Malaccan Sultanate? Doesn't make sense, right? Because this was pretty much the map of that Tanah Melayu or British Malaya when Winstead was writing his history. So he's speaking to the Malays he's writing about the histories of the entire Tanah Melayu, and he claims in his history that the histories of all of these states are connected to the Malaccan Sultanate. Okay? Whereas if you are a Malay coming from, historians will know very well that each of these individual states are individual sultanates. They have their own history, and some of them may have no links to the Malaccan Sultanate at all. Okay, or have very big links. Right? Or Kala, my great-great-grandmother was related to the prince of the Malaccan Sultanate. All right, intermarriages was very common back then because look at the geographical distances. Okay, same as the dynasties of Europe. All right, cousins will marry cousins, and of course, if you're smart enough, you can use that to your advantage to say that there are historical links to this particular dynasty. Okay. So Winstead actually toy around with the historical narratives to create a unified narrative in which to connect all of the sultanates to the Malaccan Sultanate. Okay, and he did it very well, very intelligently. Okay, and by doing so, he encouraged a sense of kind of a solidarity to identify of Malays from across the entire Malay Peninsula, at least the British Malaya, to identify with the common history of the Sultanate of Malacca. Okay, the Sultanate of Malacca today is used as a unifying narrative in Malaysia's national narrative. It's still there. Okay, we are all linked to the legacies of the Malaccan Sultanate. And his Kitab Tanah Melayu was told in a very British Malaya-centric way. Okay, and this is a structure of, you can tell already that it's strictly rooted on the boundaries of British Malaya. Sumatra, Indonesia was mentioned only out of convenience. Okay, Parameswara came from Palembang. Okay, and after Parameswara established Malaccan Sultanate, different already. Forget about Indonesia. Okay, and this is pretty much part of European historical writing tradition. History of England, Norman invasion. All right, then you start learning about French history, and after Norman invasion, the France disappeared already. Right, and the Norman kings became English kings after that. So forget about France. England has started a new identity, has transformed. The kings have heralded in the New Age for England, and they gradually became English kings. Right? Even though they had French origins and they mostly spoke French, even though they were running England. Okay, so the same practice was used by Wilbert when he was writing the history of Melayu. Indonesia was mentioned only when needed to. Okay, so this was how his history of Melayu was structured. Orang Asli, prehistory talks about the Orang Asli. He acknowledged the Orang Asli as the first people to have inhabited the Malay Peninsula, and he say why? Because if the Malays were the first to inhabit the Malay Peninsula, the Orang Asli would have extinct. Okay, because the Orang Asli are two, we say Bodoh and Berbal, stood dumb to overcome such a superior race as the Malays. Okay, so this is what he didn't have very nice things to say about the. We call them Bangsa yang Bodoh and Berbal. Okay, and the Malays, he say and that's why it's not possible for the Malays to be the first settlers in Peninsula Malaysia. So that's what he said about. He talks about the early kingdoms or sites of the Malay Peninsula in Tanah Melayu. He talks about Langkasuka, okay, Chitu Kedah, and all of the early kingdoms in northern parts of Tanah Melayu, in Perak, Kedah, and even Trinidad, perhaps even Trinidad as well. Next, he talks about Majapahit and Sriwijaya, the empires of Majapahit and Sriwijaya, the Asoka invasion, okay, and how Majapahit and Sriwijaya expanded into the Malay Peninsula as well. After Majapahit and Sriwijaya, it goes to the story of Malaya, a prince who fled the war in Palembang, okay, and he helped establish the Malacca Sultanate, and the Malacca Sultanate heralded a new age in Malay history. Right? Next, he talks about the glories of the Malaccan Sultanate, kegemilangan Kesultanan Melayu Malacca. Okay, to translate the glories of the Malaccan Sultanate, how they spread the Malay culture, the Malaccan Malay culture, and Islam to other parts of the Malay Peninsula and also into Indonesia as well. After that, he talks about decline and the Portuguese conquest and the fall of the Malaccan Sultanate. But the Malaccan Sultanate did not end there. He tried to put a sense of continuity by talking about the legacies of the Malaccan Sultanate in the Sultanates of Perak and Johor. So Malacca did not end with the Portuguese conquest. It continued in the Sultanate of Perak and Johor. And his history is very focused on the successor sultanates, or the sultanates that succeeded the Malaccan Sultanate. Malacca, Perak, and Johor. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of emphasis on the Malaccan Sultanate in his history. And his history after that ended with the expansion of British rule in Tanah Melayu. This is how our national history was structured, right?
Yes.
Exactly the same format. And you look at our history textbook today, and I've studied the SPM, right? Same.
Our museum was made.
The museum's also same, right? Exactly, that's the legacies of Wilbert's work there. That's the legacies of colonialism in our national narrative. Okay? Yeah. We always make fun of the Masaleh, right? But look at him, he's having a laugh now. Okay? And the thing is, his books were very convincing. It sounds like a Malay, and he made very good use of Malay sources to frame his narrative. He refers to, he quotes the Sejarah Melayu, the Hikayat Hang Tuah, the Tufat Al-Nafis, or any forms of the Malay hikayats you can think about.
And those were in Jawi.
Those were in Jawi, and he can read Jawi perfectly. Yeah.
Wow.
And of course, he actually compiled the dictionaries. Yeah, Malay language dictionaries. And of course, and I mentioned Indonesia was conveniently cut off after the Malaccan Sultanate. Alright? Yeah. So we do that in our national narrative as well. Indonesia is mentioned only when necessary. Alright, yes, we are part of Sriwijaya, Majapahit.
It sounds like confrontasi.
Yeah, it's not like confrontasi. Yeah. So yeah. So Winstead's history reflects the geopolitical project of British imperialism, and I've mentioned this already. And this is what I find interesting in his Kitab Tanah Melayu, the way he framed Tanah Melayu. It shows how Tanah Melayu, his awareness of how Tanah Melayu was perceived by the Malays in the 1918. When Winstead was referring to Pulau Percha, Sumatra, he used the label Tanah Melayu also. And he said, that Tanah Melayu di situ. And the interesting thing is, he Tanah Melayu, when he was referring to Sumatra, Tanah was not quoted, but he quoted Melayu. So it's like Malay land. Yeah. But when he referred to the Malay Peninsula, no, Tanah Melayu wasn't quoted at all. Okay, and this was not an author's error, It's consistently made throughout Kitab Tarikh Melayu. So again, when he was referring to Sumatra, Tanah Melayu in Sumatra, he quoted Melayu, and he said Tanah Melayu di situ. When he mentions Tanah Melayu in British Malaya, he said Tanah Melayu di sini, without quoting. And he also said Tanah Melayu kita, our Tanah Melayu, So you can see how this promotes a sense of belonging and solidarity. Alright? This is also dangerous as well because it's encouraging the Malay to switch their loyalties away from the sultans to Tanah Melayu. Yeah, Tanah Melayu. This Tanah Melayu, which is also can be dangerous also. Okay, because if in the early 20th century, if you're a Malay person, your absolute loyalty should be the sultan. Okay, so this is pretty much this shows awareness by Winstead that the term Tanah Melayu was very broad, very vague, very broad, and it can be used widely to refer to Sumatra as well. Okay, so you can see very well how the colonial attempt to geopolitically transform the term Tanah Melayu, right, and equate it to parts of the Malay Peninsula that came under British colonial control. So I'm not saying that Tanah Melayu as a term did not exist. I say that it took on a new political significance during the British colonial period. Okay? Winstead's first work on the Malay language was very important. It was acknowledged by Malays themselves. This was what Zainal Abidin bin Ahmad Zabah, he was a pendeta bahasa, okay, called as the father of modern Malay language, say about Winstead's Kitab Tarikh Melayu in 1939 when he was doing an evaluation of modern Malay literature. And this is what he said. Winstead's work, Kitab Tarikh Melayu, was the first scientific work ever produced in the Malay language on Malay history. These are the words of Zainal Abidin bin Ahmad himself. And he knows what he was talking about. It was made in 1939, and he was a Malay teacher in Malay schools, if you know his history.
Nationalist.
Yeah, a nationalist too. Okay. I've met his nephew, by the way, and talked about Winstead too. And he did acknowledge that both of them had a very close working relationship. Yeah. And he said that Kitab Tarikh Melayu was the book that opened the eyes of the Malays to modern scientific meaning of history as distinct from fiction. That's the significant influence of Winstead's work. It's acknowledged by the Malays themselves. Alright? And no other than a very important Malay figure on Malay letters and literature. And Malays, there's evidence that the Malays, especially the Merdeka generation, were aware also of the how colonialism transformed the meaning of Tanah Melayu. Alright? And this was what was said by Nabi bin Haji Abdullah. He was from the history department of UKM, and this was what he said in 1978 in his journal publication in this journal in Malaysian history. We are in Malay and I'll be translating in English. He said, cantuman di antara dua perkataan, Tanah dan Melayu, berlaku melalui proses sejarah yang sangat lama, terutamanya sehingga nama itu Tanah Melayu menjadi sebutan orang Melayu sendiri. Penjajahlah yang memainkan peranan utama menghasilkan nama itu. It was the British that first came out with this word. Alright, penjajah Inggeris yang menguasai rantau ini, tanah Melayu dan Singapura, mulai dari abad ke-18 telah berusaha meletakkan wilayah ini di bawah satu kekuasaan atau kerajaan. Dalam usaha inilah lahirnya British Malaya setelah melalui pembahagian kawasan kepada negeri Selat, negeri Melayu Sekutu dan negeri Perak Sekutu. Okay, and the next important thing that you say, tanah Melayu hanya pada abad ke-20 sahaja mulai diterima dan disebut sendiri oleh orang Melayu wilayah-wilayah ini bagi menamakan tempat mereka, bagi menggantikan nama daerah negeri asal mereka. Jelasnya konsep kebangsaan bagi orang Melayu wilayah ini dapat dilihat Tuhannya dari sudut ini juga. Okay, so Malay Malays of the Merdeka generation, you may have witnessed like British colonialism, know it very well that the origins of the term Tanah Melayu, okay, and that colonialism had a significant impact on how Tanah Melayu was framed, okay, and it became a vital point for Malay nationalism later on. Just as India, the term India became a very important identity marker for Indian nationalists later, even though there is a colonial origins of that term as well. This is a good example of the history of nationalism itself, okay. And that's pretty much where he said this. Okay, if you're interested, I can provide you my copy, my digital copy of his article here, published in 1978. I can argue that he knows what he's talking about, right? Because he's like an Malay academic in 1978 in UKM, okay, making this statement. This is also another thing that he said in the article. Sebelum orang Melayu sendiri sedar dan mula menamakan daerah ini Tanah Melayu, pihak Barat terus menuju daerah ini dengan nama Land of Malays dan kemudian diiringkan kepada Malaya. Guna nama ini oleh pihak Barat dan sebab-sebab politik penjajah, maka nama ini sebagai pendirian dan entiti yang kita kenal sekarang menjadi popular kepada orang Melayu. Terutamanya di tahun-tahun selepas 1920-an. When was Winstead's Kitab Tarikh Melayu published? 1918.
Yeah.
Okay. Benar kalau dikatakan bahawa pihak Barat khususnya Inggeris mempopularkan nama Malaya, Tanah Melayu, kedai. So there's acknowledgement that the British popularized the term or significantly transformed the term Tanah Melayu. Okay. Tetapi kebangkitan nasionalisme, penentuan kebangsaan kepada Inggeris sahaja yang memulakan penerimaan nama itu di kalangan masyarakat Melayu. So he's saying that yes, there were colonial roots in the term Tanah Melayu, but it was later adapted by Malay nationalists to help further their nationalist cause, because it provides a sense of solidarity that links Malays throughout Tanah Melayu. Okay, through the British-controlled territories. That's what Tanah Melayu was. All right. So talk about the Malacca and Malay centric construction of Malaysia's history. So these are all the other works that Winstead's published. All right. First book on Malay language. This one, I'll talk about this one, and there are other state histories as well. He pioneered a lot of Malaysia's first modern state history, and it's still widely cited today, by professional historians, both in Malaysia and internationally. If you look at a book on Malaysian history, you can find Winstead's history cited there. And if they cited a local Malay author, you look at the source, the source of that local Malay author, all of it will point back to Winstead's history. Okay? Yeah. So he wrote the history of the Malays as well. This was very craftily done because it's about the history of all the Malays in in Southeast Asia, but he put Malaysia as the core of Malay civilization. Okay, so so it's very craftily done. All right, Malaysia as the heartland of Malay civilization. Okay, and Malaya and its history. I don't have time to talk about all these publications, but they all follow the same features and characteristics, right? The same structure. So a key feature of Winstead's history is very scholarly, so it reads like contemporary scholarly work on history. Okay, and as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, if you remove the date of publication, if you remove his name, you think it's like a recent work of Malaysian history by a professional historian. Okay, he made good use of both European and Malay sources, unlike many of his predecessors like Sweden. Okay, Wilkinson also made good use of Malay scholars. Like Wilkinson did not publish as extensively as there are aspects of colonialism in his work as well, but they were very subtle. Very subtle. Okay? And if you remove the colonial pro-empire aspects of his book, that can be perfectly used as a history textbook in Malaysia. Okay? And this is, I've mentioned the structure as well, I'd like to repeat that. Okay, reflects our national narrative today. So you see this structure in these other histories of Malaya as well. His works are very Malaccan-centric, as I mentioned. Anything before the Malaccan Sultanate was considered old history, pre-history. Right? The Malaccan Sultanate heralded a new age of Malaysian history, where the spread of Malay culture triggered a renaissance in Malay culture when the Malaccan Kerajaan culture spread to all of the Kerajaans in Tanah Melayu. And with that also came the spread of Islam as well. So you can see how Winstead's history is very compatible with our national narrative because he actually places emphasis on Islam as well. Malacca as an important center for Islam. He mentioned that in his history too. And after the fall of Malacca, even though after Portuguese conquered Malacca, there's a bit of continuation from that. His histories are very pro-Malay and very pro-Sultanate. Malay history revolves around the actions of the Sultan. So he was as if he's writing a hikayat. The Sultan plays the leading role in Malay history. Right? They are the shapers and determiners of Malay history. Dismissive of the Orang Asli, and definitely dismissive of the other ethnic groups in Malaysia, the Chinese as well. And he quite often presented the Chinese and the Orang Asli are sometimes extras in the film. Right? You're there just to fill up the empty space, right? And only when you're needed, come, it's your time to play this role now. Right? The Chinese are also presented in a negative light. Okay, he's saying that it's because of the Chinese, British had to interfere. They did all of those chaos in Perak, the tin mining, the scheming of the Chinese, and that's the reason why the British had to interfere. It's not the Malays' fault, it's the Chinese fault. Okay, in that case, he actually protects the Sultanate from criticism. Okay, so you can see why his works are very attractive in the post-colonial period. Okay, because it reflects pretty much the political thinking in Malaysia during the post-colonial period. And there's definitely the Kutwanan Melayu aspect in his work as well. This is what he said about the Chinese. These works are friendly to Malay, Malay nationalism. This is what he said. In his own country, the Malay is boycotted as traded by implacable foreigners. Examples are innumerable. The trade of Malay is in the cultures, especially of the Chinese, to whom compromise over business is unthinkable. In Burma, the government had discriminated against firms that had neglected to employ Burmese. So he's advocating a Bhumi-Putra policy like that. Right? Affirmative action. And he's saying that he's constructing the Chinese as a threat. Right? If you don't keep the Chinese under control, they will threaten the Malays. Right? And we don't want that. This is what Winstead said in his history, Yeah, Winstead, Malaya in his history, 1948. Okay? His views are I also find that his views are also as if I'm hearing nations from UMNO, Not surprising. Who is that in the picture there? Tunku Abdul Rahman, yes. It was a picture that was taken in 1960s or 1950s after the formation of Malaya. Very close friend with Tunku Abdul Rahman, and he attended an UMNO meeting in London. He attended an UMNO meeting in London, and for a person like him to attend an UMNO meeting, you have to be special. Okay? Very close to the Sultan of Johor as well, the royalties, because the Sultan of Johor, when he was writing his history of Johor, proofread his works and corrected the mistakes. So his works are very powerful because there are Malay contributions to his histories and Malay endorsement as well. Why would the Sultan of Johor help him? Not because they were good friends, one. Secondly, it was because Winstead was promoting his sultanate, his place in the history of Johor. And if you look at Winstead's history, there will be a lineage tree that legitimizes the sultan's claim to the throne. Or drawn all the way to Malacca, linking it to Malacca Sultanate. Sultan Ibrahim, and this was a photo of him with Sultan Ibrahim. Okay, before he left for England. Very close friends with the royal families in Malaya. Very close friends with the Perak royal family as well. Okay. Yep.
May I have a question?
Yep.
About this topic? So,
Mhm.
what's the event happened after the lineage of the Johor kingdom changed? So, as far as I remember,
Yep.
the predecessors of the original Malacca kingdom was stopped.
Mhm.
Then the Bundahara, other.
You know what Winstead did? Yeah, he actually said that, oh, this Banda Haru who took over the Sultanate had links to the Malaccan Sultanate. Right, the grandmother married this so, and therefore, he's the legitimate heir of the Johor Sultanate.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to clarify this question that the Johor kingdom may wants to have some reinforcement officially, so this historian work may have happened by
Yeah.
other person from the region, which
Yeah.
increase business.
Yeah, exactly. And Winstead was working closely with the Sultan of Johor to write the history of Johor as well.
So,
Yeah.
in summary, both sides has pros. Yes,
Yeah.
the Winstead can write something.
Exactly.
Johor kingdom can reinforce the
The real true Winstead, because I jokingly told my supervisors that Winstead is pretty much a hikayat writer. Okay, he's writing a modern version of the hikayat Johor because he's promoting the claims of the Johor Sultanate to the Johor and putting them in the center of Johor history as well. There is interest why the Malays wanted to support his works because it helps promote the political agenda as well, and he works closely with them.
So the Mongol lineage also had claims.
You know what happened with the Mongol lineage? Winstead also drew the genealogy, said, oh, this one somehow linked by marriage to a grandmother of Sultan Mahmud of Malacca.
Like
That's
that,
why he playfully play around.
So
Because
spin
the Sultan of the Mongol, right? You know very well he's not the real Sultan of Johor. Cool. Yeah. With British support, he took over as Sultan, and that's the reason why the Sultan of Pahang at the time, right? All the sultans in Malaya, they didn't like him because he saw him as a usurper. Okay, derhaka. If you're Mongol or Bandahara, you shouldn't claim the role as a sultan. All right, you should. Yeah, that's pretty much in the hikayat also. Okay, derhaka is very bad. So the Malay sultans in other parts of Malaya knew about this, and Winstead actually, through his history, legitimizes his claim, his lineage to the Malaccan Sultanate. Saying, oh yeah, this is legitimate, lineage to the Malaccan Sultanate. Okay. So the legacies of colonialism in Malaysia's national narrative. This is the Sejarah Tingkatan 1 KDSF 2014. Look at how many times Winstead was referenced. Okay, a lot. See, look at that. And Malay works in there, right? If you look at their sources, they also reference Winstead. Okay? It's also evident in Jovinda Singh Jesse's history textbook as well, where Winstead was widely cited. Some of you have read used his work as textbook, right? It was translated into Malay as well, Jovinda Jesse's textbook. Yeah. You can say, oh, Malaysia today is different, or Sabah and Sarawak already. Do we pay attention to Sabah and Sarawak? It's still very Malacca Sultanate centric, right? So Winstead's history still remains influential in our national narrative. Alright, and in 1960, educators in Malaysia, there was a conference. They were instructed how to use Winstead's 1962 history of Malaysia for their teaching. Okay, and it remains widely cited in Malaysia's and Singapore's history. And this is a 2019 STM history question. Please prove that the Malay Sultanate of Malacca is the foundation for the emergence of Malaysia as a nation state and ethnic identity. Okay. So why Winstead remains influential? You can see it's very obvious. This Malay and Malacca culture history was useful for nation building. It provided the ideological material and historical endorsement to help UMNO build the Malaysia Tanah Melayu that they envisioned. Okay. The evidence of the evidence of Malacca-centric Kerajaan national narrative, like the Winstead's narrative, is everywhere in Malaysia. All right. This of all is in this exhibit as well, the museum's exhibit. There are different versions of Malaysia's history. The Malacca Sultanate Kerajaan-centric history is only one version of Malaysian history. Alright, there is this Dunia Melayu, Malay world version of Malaysian history, which is good to build an Indonesian nation. Alright, because if you talk about the Malay world, your attention goes away from the Malay Peninsula. Okay? That's also the Bangsa Melayu version as well, that can be anti-Sultanate. Okay? I'm not concerned about the Malay accomplishments of the Malay Sultanate. Let's talk about the accomplishment as of the Malay race itself. Alright, the Sultan is just a member of the Malay race. This is compatible to the Dunia Melayu or Malay world version of history. State-centric histories like Terengganu, Kelantan, Kedah, and Perak can also challenge the Malacca-centric version of Winstead's history as well. Why? Because you can write a continuous this states, for example, Terengganu and Kelantan had, and Perak as well, Kedah had a longer continuous existence in Malaysian history than the Malacca Sultanate. How long did the Malacca Sultanate last? 1400 to 1511, right? Only 111 years. Why are we placing so much emphasis on the Malaccan Sultanate? Right? When if you look at Kelantan and Terengganu, they had a longer continuous existence that even survived Thai and British rule, long continuous existence. Yes, they paid tribute to Thailand, but there was a Sultan. Okay? Why don't we put the gravity about history to Kelantan? Kelantan will be happy. Terengganu will be happy. That's the heartland. They claim that up until now, Kelantanese and Terengganu claim that we are the center of the Malay world in Tanah Melayu, and they can make those historical claims. They know very well. Okay. Islamic-centric history can also, it's another way of interpreting Malaysia's history, and is gaining more influence now. Okay? If you write Malaysia's history within the Islamic-centric context, they tend to ignore the pre-Islamic past of Malaysia's history. Okay? You can say that Malaysia's history started when the Sultanate became the Islamic Sultanates. Anything that is before Islam will be downplayed, okay, and ignored. Multiracial Malaysia, okay, I know some of you prefer this version of Malaysian history. It's another way of challenging the Malaccan Sultanate's history. This is very much, I say, the Singapore model, okay, where history is written. Malaysia's history should, if you follow this model, Malaysia's history should reflect the histories of all Malaysians, the historical Malaysians, the experiences of all Malaysians. The problem with that is that would challenge the Malay-centric narrative of Malaysia being culturally and historically centered on Malay history and culture. Okay, this can challenge that. And Rakyat-centric history, there is a bit of that happening as well. History of Malaysian people, Rakyat. This can also challenge this is also another model of multiracial Malaysian history, and this can challenge the Kerajaan history as well. This is very controversial, Orang Asli-centric history. Okay, if history starts with the Orang Asli, most of us here will be pendatangs. Okay, this model is adopted in Australia today. Okay, if you go to Australia, you look at this historical narrative, right? They're starting to adopt the First Nations narrative, where everybody is a colonialist apart from the First Nations. Okay, if I push this a bit, if I start pushing this across Malaysia, I'll be charged for sedition. And there are examples of Malay world and Bangsa Melayu version of Malay histories that are out there. I'm not sure if any of you are aware of Abdul Hadi bin Hassan, Sejarah Alam Melayu, that was published in 3 volumes. This was a Malay world history, one of the best historical works that I've read in the Malay language. I encourage you to read it. It was produced by someone from Malaya, in British Malaya, and he was used as a textbook in SIDC, okay, for a few years. And he portrayed Tanah Melayu not as a political entity, but as merely a geographical region. Okay, Tanah Melayu was simply part of the wider region of Dunia Melayu, right? The Malaya archipelago. His emphasis is not on the sultans; it's on Bangsa Melayu, the accomplishment and achievements of Bangsa Melayu across the Malay archipelago. He downplays and was critical of the Kerajaan as well. And what's more, you don't have to be Islam to be anak-anak Melayu. He calls Filipinos anak-anak Melayu as well, Malay children. Okay, so it shows like the broad idea of what a Malay is in before the colonial period. Okay, Filipinos can be considered Malays as well. And he called the Chinese Narakan Bumi Putra too. Okay, so he's quite inclusive in his idea of Malay identity. And Malacca is just one of the many important centers of kingdoms that have emerged in the Malay archipelago. All right, and most of its history is focused on Indonesia because Indonesia have a lot of great achievements, right? Majapahit, Sriwijaya, and all the great kingdoms. Malacca is just one bit of his history also. So that's a good example of the historical narratives that there is an alternative to Winstead's national narrative. Okay, and there are others as well. How many of you know this person? Mubin Shepherd. Yeah, he's
Our museum director.
Yeah, his history of Terengganu, state of the art. I encourage you to read it. State of the art, he hardly mentioned Malacca Sultanate in the history of Terengganu. Is only one small part of Terengganu's history. He shows that it is possible to write Terengganu's history from ancient period up to the present, continuous, without even mentioning the Malaccan Sultanate. It is possible. Victor Purcell, his Chinese-centric history of Malaya, he criticized Winstead's history. Both of them knew each other. Right? Both of them they quarreled with each other about Malaysian history, but they were like, all right, we are friends. Let's agree to disagree. And this is what he said in his history of Chinese in Malaysia. It was a criticism to Winstead's work. Malaya has ceased forever to be purely Malay. It is a plural society. And the race predominant in industry and commerce, initiative and industry, in capital and labor, blah, 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 is the Chinese. Right? The Chinese in Malaya have come to stay. You can't ignore them in histories. Winstead, don't ignore them in the history. That's pretty much what Purcell was telling Winstead in his book on the Chinese in Malaysia. So there is even contestations about Winstead's interpretation of Malaysian history. Right? And even the Malay Hikayats as well, they challenge the Malacca-centric interpretation of Malay history because the Malay Hikayats are very useful in writing an Indonesian history because their focus is not just Malacca Sultanate. They quite often talk about events outside of Peninsular Malaysia. Okay? Hikayat Mahawangsa did never mention lineage to Malacca Sultanate at all. For those of you who read it, who did the Sultan of so in Hikayat Mahawangsa, I think it was Perak or Kedah. Kedah, alright. Kedah, from whom the Sultan of Kedah was descended from? Alexander the Great. Hikayat Zulkarnain, alright. He established he fled war, alright, and established the Sultanate in Kedah, not the Malaccan Sultanate. Okay, so this narrative predates the Malaccan Sultanate by hundreds of years. Okay, so even the Hikayat itself challenges the Malaccan-centric interpretation of Malay history. And lagi best if you read the Hikayat Hang Tuah, the Malaccan Sultan was afraid of committing Derhaka to his father or grandfather in Minangkabau. All his actions, he has to think about whether this constitutes to treachery to his ancestors in Minangkabau. It shows that Malacca is beneath the Indonesian kingdoms in Indonesia. Okay, this will not be mentioned in our national narrative. Okay, this is the conclusion. Okay, it doesn't matter. I'm not saying whether I'm not trying to make a point about whether the Malacca or Kerajaan-centric history is right or wrong. In the end, the history of the nation state is shaped and decided by its own society. If for whatever reason 90% of Malaysians think that Malaysia should adopt a more multicultural history that departs from the Kerajaan approach, our nation-state historian will start looking at the hikayats again and dismiss parts and include parts that are more useful to write a more multinational history. So our history in the end is determined by all of you. Right? You determine how the history is being written. It so happens that Winston history was pretty much suit the political agenda of our post-colonial Indonesian period. Right? So thank you very much. My objective is to talk to you and to demonstrate to you the historical origins of Malaysia's nation-state history. And I hope that my talk today will help give you a better understanding of Malaysia's history, the history of Malaysia's history. All right, there you have it. And there are many different ways that Malaysian history can be written, whether it's Islamic-centric, Malay-centric, Kerajaan-centric, it's all shaped by how the society wants its history to be told. Okay, so the power is in your hands. All right? Thank you very much.